It's good to see you again. If you've been here for the last couple of nights, we've been together. This is the third night, one more tomorrow night, and it'd be great to see you back at that. We're thinking this evening, as the guys have said, about hope. And like me, I guess, when I was young, we all hope that our lives will count for something. Lots of us set out in life with all kinds of hopes, and we really do want our lives to count for something. I'm guessing that you're sitting here this evening and you want your life to mean something. You want it to be significant. You want to leave a mark. You want your time here to have meant something. Some of you, I guess, might have designs on public office. You maybe have the New Year's honours list in view. But even those of us with more humble aspirations want our peace, our time, however long it's going to be, in this drama that we call life. We want it to be significant. We want to have good relationships. We want to have a good reputation with others, don't we? And we want our work, whatever our work will be, we want it to be done well. That's why we make plans, isn't it? That's why we pursue ambitions. That's why we get up in the morning, because we want our lives to count for something. But there is a problem with that. And we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to factor into these desires this problem. And it is an awkward and really rather inconvenient and somewhat, well, it's a bit stinky, actually, this reality, and that is the awkward and unavoidable reality of death. You say, oh great, puddings, it's all very light and nice, and now you brought a bit of a downer on things. Thanks very much for doing that. Why did you need to bring death into the story? Well, death is a bit of a taboo. I'm aware of that. We don't like talking about it so much, but sometimes taboos need to give way to reality, don't they? And when I was thinking about all of these things, the reality came rushing in on me when I came across something written by the Russian author Leo Tolstoy. Now, Tolstoy has been one of the most influential authors of really the last century. He's written some of the finest literature, War and Peace, Anna Karenina. You maybe know those books, you maybe read them. His contribution to the world could only really be described as significant, very significant. He certainly left more of a mark on history than many of us will ever do, even with our highest aspirations. But it was at the age of 50 that Tolstoy began to question his life. And he said this, it'll come up here. My question, he said, that which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions. A question without an answer to which one cannot live. It was this: what will come of what I am doing today or tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Why should I live or do anything? The question could also be expressed like this: is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? See his point? Do you see his reason for anguish? If death always wins, if it's just the grave and that's it, if death wins, what ground is there for hope in anything, really? Why should I live or do anything? Is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? Think about it in terms of our lives. If death has the last laugh, how is any hope that we have for our lives or the lives of our loved ones, how is it not just rendered utterly useless? Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, puts it very starkly in this long quote. Follow it with me. He said, "Yet what a difference there is between our beginning and our end. We begin in the madness of carnal desire and the transport of voluptuousness. We end in the dissolution of all our parts and the musty stench of corpses." He didn't pull his punches. And the road from one, the beginning, to the end, the road from one to the other too goes, in regard to our well-being and enjoyment of life, steadily downhill. Happily dreaming childhood, exultant youth, toil-filled years of manhood, infirm and often wretched old age, the torment of the last illness, and finally the throes of death. Does it not look as if existence were an error, of the consequences of which gradually grow more and more manifest? We shall do best to think of life as a process of disillusionment, since this is clearly enough what everything that happens to us is calculated to produce. Yeah, can you imagine a night out with him? He's pretty brutal, isn't he, in the way that he puts it? And we initially think, that can't be right. It can't just be like that. It can't be that hopeless, that grim. But it's actually pretty hard to fault his logic, do you think? If there is no God, and death is the end, then our existence is entirely accidental. And it doesn't matter how any of us behave. It doesn't matter. We might create the finest art, we might write the finest poetry, we might play the finest music. It just doesn't matter. That's our lives. What about our relationships? We invest time and energy in establishing loving relationships, don't we? We make sacrifices for other people for the sake of relationships. We take risks for the sake of relationships. We put others first. We do these things that cost us, and then we die. And, well, then we're just no different from the person who spent their life using and abusing other people. My father was a good man. He was a kind husband and father. He was a good friend to his friends. He was a good laugh. He was a decent guy. He was just an all-round top lad, we might say. He died 20 years ago this year, and his grave in Belfast is a matter of meters away from a man who spent his life trying to murder other people and had some success in doing it. That's it. He's there. The other guy's there. If the grave wins, if death is the end, the difference between how my dad treated people and how this man treated people is no different. It doesn't matter. If we loved people or hated them, if we cared for people or used them, if we were popular or lonely, ultimately nobody will care, because death renders our relationships meaningless. Can you see how this works? We want our lives to count for something. We want our lives to have meaning and significance, but the reality of death stands in the way of all of that. If death wins, everything that we consider foundational to real human flourishing has no real significance. And old Macbeth, all those years ago, was right. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets its hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. If death is all there is, then our lives signify nothing. And that is hopeless. But that doesn't fit with how we feel, does it? I think I maybe quoted him the other night, Foy Vance, the Northern Irish singer-songwriter. He has a song called Two Shades of Hope. And the song talks about the pain that being given hope in a particular situation, being given hope in the face of hardship, brings when ultimately it doesn't deliver. So he says, I guess that's why love hurts and heartache stings, and despair is never worse than the despair that death brings. But hope deals the hardest blow. We can relate to that if you've been told that there's a treatment that might cure this sickness. Your hopes are lifted, and then ultimately it doesn't work. Having the hope in the first place almost makes the failure of that thing even more painful and more difficult. But there's just one line in the song that goes deep in all of us. Hope deals the hardest blow, he says, but I cannot help myself but hope. Deep in all of us is an instinct that our lives do matter, that our relationships do matter, that loyalty and faithfulness and trust and honesty are good things. They're not meaningless things. That our achievements matter. That there's more to what we've done in life than a granite headstone with a few well-meaning words engraved on it. That's the intuition that's there in all of our hearts, and the Christian claim is that that intuition is there because we were created for more than what we can see and touch. Kate Douglas, writing in The New Scientist, describes our whole existence is just a passing whim, she says. But what if that isn't the case? What if there might be a reason to believe that death isn't the end, and that all our hopes and everything we most value won't be destroyed? What would you give to find out whether that was true? Well, Christianity says that we don't have to accept a hopeless view of the world. And the reason that it says that is because at its foundation, the reason that it says that is because 2,000 years ago, Jesus Christ walked out of the tomb. He rose from the dead. And there are two big implications of that. It means two things. That event means two massive things. And the first is this. It means he defeats death. He defeats death. The whole Christian faith stands or falls at this point. And this sort of thing isn't just the run-of-the-mill. You might hear Christians talk about the resurrection like that kind of thing is just normal and run-of-the-mill. So we need to check the evidence. We need to see if it is a credible claim. And the first is this empty tomb that's there in the first couple of verses of the passage that was read for us, the empty tomb. Let me read it again. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him." This happened 3 days after Jesus was publicly and professionally executed by the religious and secular authorities, and Mary and some other women came to Jesus' tomb. They look inside. One of the other gospel writers tells us they see bandages, but there's no body. Now let's be clear, no one expected this. She didn't go to the tomb expecting this. Nobody expected this. Dead men don't rise. It's normal to hear people say today that they deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ because these things don't happen. This can't happen because it doesn't happen, but that actually is to decide the outcome before considering the details. That actually is what Mary thought when she went to the tomb. So where was the body? That's the question. Where was it? Well, people over the years have proposed different options. They say, well, look, maybe Jesus didn't die. Maybe he was unconscious on the cross, but when they took him down, put him in the cool of the tomb, that kind of revived him, and he got up and he left. The problem with that is that he was executed by trained killers who knew what it looked like to kill somebody, knew what it involved, and knew what it looked like when someone was dead. And also, if he'd been brutalized as much as he had in getting to the cross, how is it that so soon afterwards he's able to get up and move such a massive stone at the door that one person wouldn't be able to move? Maybe Jesus didn't die. It's unlikely. Second thing people often say is maybe the authorities could have taken it. Well, that's actually what the disciples think. Verse 2. You see, they've taken the body. But that makes no sense. Because if they had the body, if the authorities had the body, then all they had to do was show everyone that they had the body, and the whole history of Christianity would never have got off the ground. We wouldn't be talking about it today because it would have been debunked right at the very beginning. If they had the body, all they would have had to do was show it. Another thing people say, maybe the disciples stole it. The disciples stole the body. Maybe they hid it. But this doesn't make sense either. The disciples were terrified at this point. When Jesus was arrested and sentenced to death, they all ran away. They feared that the same thing that had happened to him would happen to them. And we read later, actually in the book of Acts, we read that they were all locked away in a room afraid that the authorities might find them. They were terrified and they did a runner. And yet, as time moves on, each one of them ended up giving their lives on the basis that Jesus had risen from the dead. See, you're unlikely to endure the sort of torture and go to your death as these guys did if you know that the body's hidden in your mate's garage. That's the empty tomb. Secondly, we need to consider the eyewitnesses. So we've got Peter there in verse 6, the other disciple who we know was John, the author of John's Gospel. And verse 8, they saw the empty tomb firsthand. Then we're told about Mary in verse 10. And it's important that we're told about Mary because in the culture of the time when this was written, women were marginalized. And they were marginalized to the extent that their testimony was not considered legal in a court of law. Women's testimony in court wasn't considered legitimate. Now that means if you're going to make up a story about this, if you're going to create a legend around this idea, this guy rose from the dead, let's write a story to say that he rose from the dead when he didn't really do it. There's absolutely no way that you would use a woman as the first eyewitness. The only reason that you would say that women were the first to see Jesus alive again is if women were the first to see Jesus alive again. And then it's the disciples' turn, verse 20. And finally there's Thomas over the page, over a couple of pages, verse 24 to 29. I feel a bit sorry for Thomas. Because of this incident, Thomas has been known for millennia now as Doubting Thomas. It's hung around him for all that time, but I'd have been exactly the same. Don't forget, he wasn't present when Jesus first appeared to the disciples. Verse 24, we're told there, he was not with the disciples when Jesus came. And he was earlier present when he saw Jesus dying. So he saw him having been killed, and he wasn't there when he first appeared. So he's skeptical. But then Jesus appears to him and says, verse 27, peace be with you, Thomas. Put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas, the skeptic, is convinced. He wasn't going to fall for any old nonsense. He's convinced. Verse 28, my Lord and my God. Those are the eyewitnesses. None of them expected to see Jesus risen from the dead. But he appeared to them and they were convinced. And there were also many more. In a very early account of Jesus' resurrection, one New Testament author says that he appeared to 500 people at once, many of whom were still alive when he wrote. So somebody come and say, Jesus rose from the dead, and they say, oh, no way, I saw him, like whatever. Say, well, look, if you don't believe me, you can go and see that guy down there, number 42, go in there, he was there that day. If you don't believe him, actually, the other side of town, there were hundreds of people. This wasn't something that happened kind of stuck away in a corner with only a few people, the in crowd that were going to kind of work this out, tell this story. No, he appeared publicly, very obviously, for all kinds of people to see. One other thing to say, it's very tempting for us to think, well look, people were far more gullible back then. They believed this kind of silly stuff went on. It's not like that with sophisticated people like us today. Well, that is to do what C.S. Lewis, and that's to engage in what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. That is to think that over the passing of time we're somehow smarter than those people. Look, the idea of Jesus coming back to life again from the dead was just as implausible then as it is for people today. All the evidence suggests that people back then had just as much trouble believing it as we do today. But the fact that thousands did suggests that the evidence was just too compelling. In fact, one historian, Professor N.T. Wright, concluded this: the early Christians did not invent the empty tomb and the meetings or the sightings of the risen Jesus. To suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and enter into a fantasy world of our own. It's here he's saying, look, to debunk all of that, to ignore it all, is to forget history. It's to consign history to the bin. Now, I know that in conversations with some of you this week, several of you have said that you don't think that there's enough evidence for Christianity. Well, what do you make of the empty tomb? What do you make of the evidence of the empty tomb? What do you make of the evidence of the eyewitnesses? Let me put it like this, what is your more plausible alternative to what that fits with all of these facts? Jesus defeated death. Now, why does that matter for us? Well, because it means that death is not the end. It means that it isn't just about the gravestones. And that being the case also then means the second big implication, the second big thing, and that is that Jesus doesn't just, in defeating death, secondly, he destroys despair. He destroys despair. We get a glimpse of this with Mary. She starts in tears, verse 11. She's at the tomb in despair. Death has won again. She's coming along, another funeral, another death, more misery. That's the story of life, isn't it? But look how that changes when she realizes that Jesus is alive. Verse 17. She's overcome and she grabs him with a sense of delight. Jesus said, "Don't hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." See, Mary shifts from despair to hope and purpose. Why? Simply because she met the resurrected Jesus and understood what that implied. A few years back, the Australian comedian Tim Minchin, you come across him, Tim Minchin spoke at a graduation ceremony in his homeland, and he began by saying this: "Arts degrees are awesome, he said. And they help you find meaning where there is none. And let me assure you, there is none. Don't go looking for it. Searching for meaning, searching for meaning in life, is like searching for a rhyme scheme in a cookbook. You won't find it, and you'll ruin your souffle. Now, if death is the end, Tim Minchin's right. But why do we search for meaning? Why is there that longing, that desire in our hearts to do that? Why this intuition that our lives should be meaningful? Why is it there when the only world that we've ever known is one where everybody dies? The Bible teaches that it's because death is an intruder. Death is an alien intruder into our world. It is a sign that something has gone wrong, that our relationship with the source of life and meaning and significance, the God who made us, that relationship is broken. And that's why, ultimately, why we die. See, death is not just a biological accident. It is a spiritual reality. And the Bible makes sense of why we have this longing for meaning and significance, even in a world like that. And it shows us why that search will not end unless our relationship with God is restored. If Jesus didn't rise, Tim Minchin is right. If death wins, everything is pretty bleak. But because Jesus gets through death, he has the power to get you and me through death as well. And that means that despair is lifted. The despair of the grave is no more. And that's why when Mary finds Jesus and embraces him, it's such a moment of hope and relief. Her shattered dreams have been pieced back together in that single moment. And that's why when Jesus calls God my Father and your Father, they are words that can transform all of our lives, all of us. Because if you trust in Jesus, whoever you are, wherever you come from, whatever you've done in the past, if you trust in Jesus, you're drawn into the divine family. And that gives the whole of your life purpose. You see, at root, Jesus didn't die and rise again just to resolve the philosophical problem of human significance. He died and rose so that you could feel his embrace for eternity. So that the relationship that really matters in your life, the relationship between you and the one who sits at the center of all reality, he did it so that that relationship could be restored. Yes, the resurrection means that the way that you live now, what you achieve, the contribution you make, the relationships you invest in, all of those things will all have lasting effect. It also means that Jesus, though, will one day assess our lives. We'll have to give an account to him for how we've lived. And perfect justice on that day will be done. But above all else, the resurrection gives us the certain hope of a seat around God's family table. We're drawn into that relationship. And it's a family table where there is feasting and there is joy for all eternity. And like Mary, our lives will be still marked by the frustrations of the everyday, still stained, as it were, by the grief and tragedy that marks human life. But Jesus taught that his resurrection wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning. The beginning of God's new world, where pain and mourning and everything else that renders this world meaningless are no more. They're done away with. They're taken away completely. And so from that day on, Mary knew that her future wasn't in the tomb, but it was in the garden. It wasn't to anoint the dead, but it was to embrace the living. It wasn't to die, but it was to live. And this evening, I want to say that that is the hope that Jesus' followers have had ever since. And that is the hope that is an offer to you. Now, we'll all respond to this. I think there are three ways that we might respond this evening. Three groups of people, if you like, I suppose. Three categories. The first is some of you will be here and you're not really sure that you get it. You might have come the last couple of nights and you've been engaging what we've been saying, but it's just not really dropping into place. You don't really get it. Well, look, let me say to you, please don't stop there. Continue with your questions. Continue with that curiosity. We'd love you to take this feedback form and fill it in. The guys will tell you in a few minutes how to do that and what's required there. There's a follow-up course where you get a chance after this week to continue to explore, ask the questions. We'll have a question time in a few minutes so you can ask some of those preliminary questions, but those things, don't allow that curiosity. Don't allow those things, the kind of, I don't really get it, to let you stop there. Some of you say that. Don't keep following it through. The second group, some of you say, you know you don't want it. You've been here, you've heard these things, and you think, it's not for me, I don't want it. Well, can I encourage you, before you reject Christ, and you might want to do that, but before you reject Christ, make sure that you reject the real Jesus. And what I mean by that is, lots of people that I talk to reject Jesus on the basis of hearsay. They reject him on the basis of opinions that they've heard, but they've never really engaged with Jesus as he reveals himself to us in the Gospels. I'd encourage you to take one of these away, read it through, look at the person of Jesus and interrogate him and his character, as it were, with your questions and see if he stands up. If you're going to reject him, reject the real Jesus. But there will be some of you here this evening, and you're convinced. You've been here this week. You want the love that we talked about the first night, the truth we talked about last night, and the hope that Jesus offers this evening. Well, if you're convinced and you want this, to do that you need to come to God and you need to say three simple things. You need to admit something, you need to believe something, and you need to commit to something. The first is you need to admit that you've sinned against God and his world. Secondly, you need to believe that Jesus' death is all that can save you from that sin. And thirdly, you need to turn from your sin and trust in Jesus. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just say a very short prayer. Some of you, you can just ignore it. But those of you who are convinced and who want this hope, I'm going to read it through, and then I'm going to read it more slowly and invite you to pray it in your heart. It'll just go like this. Lord God, I have sinned against you, choosing to do things my way rather than follow you. Thank you for sending Jesus to die for my sin and offer me forgiveness. I want to turn from my sin and trust in Jesus for my salvation. Amen. Now that's all it is. I'm going to say it, and if you want to echo it, please feel free. Echo it quietly in your heart. You don't need to say anything. Lord God, I have sinned against you, choosing to do things my way rather than follow you. Thank you for sending Jesus to die for my sin and offer me forgiveness. I want to turn from my sin and trust in Jesus for my salvation. Amen.